Hi everyone. As we move this week through the rest of night, I want to take some time to reflect on some of the highlights from the article you read by Paulette Alden, or blog post you read by her last week, on week 3, and pull out some of the highlights and connect them to what we see in night. This week's discussion post description goes into some detail about why memoir is so essential to understanding events like the Holocaust. You can read the facts, and they can horrify you. You can see the pictures, and they can horrify you. But there is a distance when we look at these things happening to other people, particularly if these other people are separated from us by time, by culture, by faith, by geography. And really, in the case of the Holocaust, that time feels so different from our times that you can look at it, you can feel sorry, you can feel dread, you can feel horror, but you may not be able to see yourself in those pictures or imagine yourself in the cattle cars. And that's really the heart of empathy. And it is really the key to these sorts of studies, these sorts of examinations of the past, the key to unlocking them in such a way that they have meaning in the present. Because the study of history really is the study of human nature and all the variations of which human nature is capable. And human nature, in my personal opinion, does not change in fundamental ways over the course of time. Conventions surrounding it might change, and the cultures, the languages, the laws under which people live, these things all might change, but you're wrestling with the same human nature. Later in the course, I will examine some genocides which have taken place in more recent history. And reflect in those cases on how we see the horrors that happened under the Nazis being reflected in different cultural experiences, different historical situations among people who are very different from each other. Okay, there is something in human nature which makes it possible for us to dehumanize people who are unlike us, and that was really the heart of the week 2 discussion on fearing the stranger. And if we are not really highly critical of our own thinking process, of our own perspectives, then we are going to run the risk of being manipulated or of simply falling into erroneous and maybe dangerous beliefs about other people. The Germans, who believed what they believed about the Jews, did not see themselves as bad people. And in things other than that belief, they may have had good qualities, even the sorts of things they would look at each other and say, we're great, this is, German culture is great, the way we live our lives is a good way to live our lives. And that actually, in their minds, can reaffirm what they were believing about gypsies, Jews, homosexuals, all the other groups that were targeted, Slavs that were targeted, but particularly the Jews, who were not only targeted to a degree the other groups weren't targeted, but were also perceived through a lens of historical and quasi-scientific prejudice and hatred, which was really unique. There were prejudices against the gypsies, and there are in many of the societies in which you have gypsies or similar cultures like the Travelers of Ireland, but not the deeply rooted hatred that is built into anti-Semitism. So Alden says, literary memoir originates in memory and personal experience. So it is your experience that you are writing about. The personal piece of this is very important because it is possible to write about yourself in a way that moves away from memory and just your subjective experience of events, and that's autobiography. If you read something like the autobiography of Ben Franklin, for example, it is a work that is not focused on his day-to-day experience of his life. He hits the highlights of his life, but it's very much with an eye to recording certain events. The contract with the reader is that you're telling the truth as you know it and have discovered it and believe it to be true. And that's the second piece. So when you write a memoir, even though it's grounded in your memory and your personal experience, you do promise the reader, there's an implied promise to the reader that what you are saying is true as best you can, as best you remembered, as best you could discover it, if you dug in and tried to research events, and that you genuinely believe it. In other words, you're not consciously lying, and that you've taken some pains to re-examine those events, to make sure your memory isn't clearly wrong, clearly deceptive. Memoir is about the writer's experience, even if it is about someone else. So if I were to write a memoir of my mother, what makes it a memoir and not a biography is it is going to be about my experience of my mother, even if I talk about her life before I was born. It's my engagement with the discovery of her past and how it impacts my understanding of my present. A biography, on the other hand, would simply tell the story of that person's life, and I wouldn't be present in it at all. It would be completely objective, even if it were someone very close to me. Memoir has a narrative shape. In other words, it has a story. It is written like and using the tools of fiction, right? So it will have scenes, it will have rising action, falling action, it will have reflection. When you read Night, you could almost imagine it's a novel, except you know it's not. Okay? This is, again, what distinguishes memoir from biography and autobiography. Biography and autobiography may focus on certain aspects of the subject's life, but the focus is really on conveying the major events of that life, and it is not necessarily going to be shaped like a piece of fiction. It will involve some degree of reflection. What makes it a memoir, what people read memoirs for, is for that reflection. It will have a focus most times. I skipped that bit of it, which means it kind of has a theme. In other words, you're writing about your life, but you're pulling something specific out of it. Okay? Usually, if the writer is capable of this, the language of the memoir will be crafted. In other words, the sorts of concerns you would put into writing a novel or a short story, those will go into writing that memoir. That's not always the case. Not everyone who writes a memoir has the ability to do that, but many people who write memoirs write other kinds of writing as well. In fact, Wiesel is also a novelist, and so you can see that in his writing. Now, what is a challenge for us reading Night is the fact that it's in translation. So we can't really reflect too deeply on the language, aside from the skill of the translator, just because we're not reading it in the original language. Memoir is often used, the tools of the novelist, so things like describing things in scenes, a series of scenes, one thing happens after the other. The flow of the scene incorporates dialogue and action, drama, dialogue, and plot. So memoirists will often try to tell their story and give it the sort of completeness and shape that fiction would have. And again, this is what distinguishes memoir from autobiography. Memoir is often both story and essay, to the extent that it reflects. In other words, story tells me what happened. Essay typically reflects on its subject. It says something about it. It digs deeper beneath the surface. But the degree of both can vary greatly from memoir to memoir. So some memoirs may be more story. This is what happened. These are the events as I remember them. Others may dive more deeply into the reflection, and they may span a very, a relatively short chunk of time. They might have very limited story, but have the author's reflections on that woven in there. If you look at Walden, Walden is kind of a memoir of Thoreau's time in the cabin in the woods. I almost went into bunny foo-foo there, but anyhow, Walden's time living on Walden Pond, and he has elements of what happened there, but it's not a chronological story of his time. It is key moments built into what are kind of essays reflecting on aspects of how he views the world, of how he thinks human beings should live as individuals and in society. As readers, we experience another mind on the page, musing. In other words, I'm seeing the author reflecting on these events. I'm getting to see the author digest the things that have happened to him or her. We have the experience of intimacy with another person, a voice speaking truth, at least emotional and psychological truth. And the last two are very important because, again, the memoir writer commits to telling the truth as best they remember it, but memoirs are not necessarily held to the same standard of accuracy that an autobiography or a biography would be. So that person's perception of events may be inaccurate, not in terms of things that happen, but motivations of the people around them or whatever. But the memoir will reflect that individual's emotional and psychological truth. In other words, what did those things mean to that person? We are attracted to what really happened, experience unfiltered through fiction or fantasy, and also how someone else deals with life experience. So we do want to have a sense that what happened, happened, but we also want to see how it is experienced by that person, with pain or loss or trauma or being gay or coming of age or whatever. We look for wisdom, understanding, not just the experience, but what the writer makes of it, and there's so much of that in Night. So much of Night is a reflection on what was happening, how it was shaping him, and how it made him look at the world and the people around him differently. How you say what happened to you, not just what happened. Not only do I want to say it, but I want to say it well. And again, this is very much true of Night. Wiesel has created a beautiful work of art. And were it not a memoir, were it a work of fiction, it would still be beautiful. We accept that imagination is involved to the extent that the person is remembering and writing and recreating experience, not doing an actual factual recording. We understand the fallibility of memory, the unreliability of it, but our understanding is that the writer is doing his or her best to capture the truth of the matter, not to fabricate, not to make things out to be what they weren't. But we accept shaping and rearranging of time. Okay? So in other words, on the first piece of this is we understand that memory is fallible, but we hope the author we have that contract with the author that he or she is doing their best to tell us as things were. But we do accept shaping and rearranging of time in memoirs. In other words, if a few days are condensed into one, if the sequence of events may be a bit different than they were. I described the events of a day in a way that has a dramatic effect, does not significantly impact the accuracy of events, but for dramatic effect to set something up, that to a degree is considered acceptable in memoir. Vivian Gornick, and this is Alden quoting her, says, "Good writing has two characteristics. It's alive on the page, and the reader is persuaded that the writer is on a voyage of discovery." And then Alden says, she goes on, Gornick, to pose these questions for the memoirist. Is the narrator indulging in self-serving confessionalism here, or is the narrator honestly going to try to get to the bottom of the matter being presented, showing me the widest view and making the deepest sense of what happened? In other words, some people may write a memoir because they want their version of something to come out. And we see this a lot with celebrity memoirs. This is what happened in my marriage, why it went south. This is what happened in this business deal, why it didn't go the way I wanted it to go. Politicians, this is why things happened during my reign or whatever, in a way that spins it, that tries to put a better light on it. A true memoir, a well-written memoir, we have faith that the writer is honestly trying to get to the bottom of things and reflect on their meaning. Do I believe this voice? Am I attracted by this tone? So this is the tools of fiction, the tools of writing coming in to reassure the reader and to kind of establish the writer's credibility, the connection between reader and writer. Am I drawn to this persona? And when we remember ourselves in the past, we are creating a persona. Even if we're not intentionally changing how we present ourselves and present ourselves differently than we knew we were to be, that we were, we are going to remember ourselves through the filter of all the things that we believe to be true about ourselves. And beyond that, does the shape of the writing compel? Is it well written? Is the language expressive? Is the story being told through tone, language, and shape? I just want to draw a few lines from Elie Wiesel's acceptance speech when he received the Nobel Peace Prize in Oslo. And this is, the entire speech is at the beginning of the edition of Night that was in the bookstore, at least. So the one that you're more than likely reading does include his speech in the introductory materials. It is with a profound sense of humility that I accept the honor you have chosen to bestow upon me. I know your choice transcends me. This both frightens and pleases me. What does he mean by I know your choice transcends me? Because he was selected in large part not just for his gifts as a writer and for the work that he's done, but for what he has said about that time and what he's done to make meaning of it in the years since. So in a way, the acknowledgement of Wiesel is seen as an acknowledgement of the horrors that happened in the Holocaust, but also how that has had an impact on shaping the world in positive ways thereafter. It's had an impact in negative ways as well, but certainly people whose experience of that made them more humane, made them want to struggle against those sorts of things happening again. It was transformative, and many of them did tremendous good in the world. It frightens me because I wonder, do I have the right to represent the multitudes who have perished? Do I have the right to accept this great honor on their behalf? I do not. That would be presumptuous. No one may speak for the dead. No one may interpret their mutilated dreams and visions. It pleases me because I may say that this honor belongs to all the survivors and their children, and through us to the Jewish people with whose destiny I have always identified. So, on the negative side, he knows he can't be the voice for those who die. On the positive side, it's an acknowledgement of the honor that the survivors and the children of the survivors have earned by getting through this experience, and the Jewish people as a whole. I remember it happened yesterday or eternities ago. A young Jewish boy discovered the kingdom of night. I remember his bewilderment. I remember his anguish. It all happened so fast, the ghetto, the deportation, the sealed cattle car, the fiery altar upon which the history of our people and the future of mankind were meant to be sacrificed. I remember he asked his father, "Can this be true?" This is the 20th century, not the Middle Ages. Who would allow such crimes to be committed? How could the world remain silent? And that is the heart, I think, of why we read this memoir. And now the boy is turning to me. "Tell me," he asks, "what have you done with my future? What have you done with your life?" And I tell him that I have tried to keep memory alive, that I have tried to fight those who would forget, because if we forget, we are guilty, we are accomplices. And that is young Wiesel and Wiesel later in life. So that's it. So that is a bit of more reflection on literary memoir and an attempt to connect it tonight and to go into a bit more detail about why memoir is become such an important genre for the literature of the Holocaust. And there are other genres. We're going to read novels about the Holocaust. There, of course, we're going to see a film about the Holocaust. There are factual books that may combine some, not so much memoir, but giving voice to the people who experienced these events in a way that is more literary than purely informative. And Children of the Flames is that kind of book. But memoir is very important to bringing us into the past in a way that we can see through the eyes of the people who experienced the past and hopefully see ourselves in them.